Okay, this is chapter 5, and I'm going to think through it with you, right? So please, if you have not read chapter 5, don't listen to the video. Go back, read it, and then we'll do this together, okay? I think that the key part here is that now we are starting to look for and connect to specifics, to practice, to examples. Right, and I want us to always merge the conceptual, the kind of critical aspects of what we're trying to do when we're thinking about policy and policy practice, and the practical as well. I don't want the idea of policy to be this rarefied, up in the air, wonky thing. I mean, there's plenty of opportunity for that. If you're interested in that, there's plenty of other materials I can provide you. And in fact, throughout the course, I'm gonna, end with Canvas. There's gonna be things that go beyond the scope of the class, right? So just for reference and as materials you can check out later. I want to talk about here in chapter 5. Chapter 5 starts with this idea of the importance of school, and the school as a space for developing a sense of who we are, and understanding governance and civics, right? You can see right on page 106 that I cite a really interesting work of Michelle Fricker, where she talks about epistemic injustice, right? So the kinds of things that are not presented to us and we're not invited to think through in schools, but also schools here meaning higher education, right? I think that not thinking about policy as part of teacher work is one of these kinds of epistemic injustice, right? And the kinds of things that really shortchanges the way in which we teachers enter schools and how they can be successful within that kind of first to 5 years in particular, right? And of course, how they grow and develop and thrive afterwards. But I think that it's a critical aspect, particularly in a time where society is changing, where music and the nature of music in schools is changing. Right, if we look globally, the idea of music as equating to ensembles as it is in the U.S. has changed quite dramatically. Even in the U.S. per se, alternatives to the traditional ensembles are coming back more and more. Right, modern band has grown, the popular music engagement, repertoire, and the ways in which, for instance, in choral environments, right? We have seen, for instance, in ACDA, American Choral Director Association, we have seen more and more the connections between different kinds of practices, right? So choral improvisation, choral connected to communities of practice, right? For instance, the influence of African American traditions within the choral environment beyond the traditional understandings of spirituals, but now thinking about how orality plays a role, right? A key role in how we can teach music, how notions of literacy that have been traditionally connected to notation can also be played out and can have had cultural and contextual value in different forms, right? The oral kind of forms of literacy have been significant and part of multiple kind of cultural practices, including in Western traditions, right? So not just this kind of schism separations that seem artificial. All this is to talk about this idea of Fricker's idea that the kind of prejudice that causes a hearer to give a deflated level of credibility to a speaker's word, right? This is on page 106. And I think that it's worth thinking a little bit about that because that has multiple implications, right? So when do we do that, for instance, in relationship to our students? When do we do that in relationship to musical and cultural practices that we're not familiar with? When is it that is done to us from principals or from upper administration or decision makers, right, that don't see educators or they don't see cultural workers as having a particular insight, right, that is valuable, that can frame policy, right? So this is the kind of thing that I'm interested in the chapter 5 tries to articulate, right from the beginning. It tries to this kind of sense of amplifying the capacity to hear others, strengthening a disposition to our collaborative work, and fostering a sense of autonomy. Right? Autonomy, there's not just our autonomy within the classroom, but across. And so when you see what we can start doing today here, as you see on page 107, this is the kind of work that we're trying to articulate, right? There's a kind of a call to action, so to speak, that is embedded into this process. So when you see, for instance, on page 109, I talked about Eric Shea, which I mentioned earlier, in this kind of Metropolitan Expeditionary Learning School, right? So you can check them out, and you can see many other models there like this. I think these are the kind of on the continuum, the most teacher-directed, teacher-centered work, right? And I think that that's very important for us to conceive, that these things exist and they're part of schools in many parts of the country, and certainly globally. So the idea that educators, teachers can have a real influence in that process is not, pie in the sky. It's not unusual, right? This is happening everywhere we might not be familiar with. And at times, teacher education, higher education, university does not do the job of kind of pointing to these things, because people are so concerned with, knowing how to do the lesson plan and knowing how to manage the choral environment or the band or, so forth and so on. Of course, all these things which are really important and crucial to a good experience, to a good learning experience, to a good program development. But these things have limitations too, right? And they live in a larger context. And that context matters significantly to what kinds of things we can do and the kinds of things that we fail to do, right? Because we don't know how to push that forward and the impact that has, and so forth and so on, right? So I'm really interested in this idea of the kind of rehabilitation of our relationship with policy and what that can look like. So you will see that in the next few pages up until 111, what I'm trying to show is that she and his colleagues are really trying to show how this work can be done, how this work can connect, for instance, to inquiry groups, how they can be present educators as really connected to participatory action, right? Really connected to kind of consciousness raising, really connected to kind of having a sense of agency within the work that they do. But this is, there's many other examples and stories that go on that are told here. So for instance, on page 112, you have the work of Danelle Larson, 15 years ago, talking about, she kind of restructured her band environment to become like more small group action, right? Coming back and forth and trying to use pedagogically and structurally the small group environment to amplify the sense of autonomy for students, so becoming more student-centered. But what that led is also a change in the nature of the music making and the program for the school in general, because these small ensembles now could do different repertoire, they could be doing different things, they were more student-led, that impacted after-school programs, it impacted the musical, and impacted kind of in the nature of the performances, impacted organization and interaction with other arts programs. It connected participation with the English department. It connected project-based that were connected to the history and social studies. So that simple shift, right, within the pedagogical had implications to the policy, had implications to the content, had implications to participation and networking, coalition, so forth, right? If we think about work with incarcerated youth, as a whole other environment, the connection between schools and community, higher education and community, the connections to what does it mean to teach in their environment, to mean the relationship to resources, the relationship to arguments, why the vision of something that should happen in that space as a purpose for music education. How do we learn that? How do we connect this, for instance, to higher education? We're thinking about school communities as well. We think about repertoire and connections to LGBTQ programs. We can think about notions of, center and periphery, right? The kinds of programs that can happen periodically, right? Like 3 or 4 week programs that focus on a particular idea, rather than the traditional repertoire building kind of idea. Compositional elements. We just graduated here it's a great dissertation by Chris Waskold that talked about collaborative compositional practice in the choral classroom. right? So this is just done here in Connecticut, just now, right? Project-based, thinking about the changes that the program leads then to changes in policy, and how having a kind of policy practice allow that to take place, right? Facilitated that process, right? So that we think about this ideas of flexibility and hybridity into the classroom, right? A distributed kind of practice, right? It's how do we change and synthesize experiences? So if you look at page 115 and 116, you see how, for instance, the Arizona State University program had tried to shift their whole higher education, teacher education program in order to do those things, right? So they shifted the policy and the direction and the design of the program, and they had to do with accreditation. They had to do all kinds of things in order to then bring a different practice, right? To get teachers, their future teachers, right? Their teacher music initial certification there, kind of to think about these issues differently. And you see this issue here at TC as well. You see the shift between the kind of practices that we try to do in the classrooms and what might be happening in schools, right? And that tension is always present, but the tension is always mediated also by the teacher. And that's what can or cannot be done, what's the difference between what goes on in higher education and in schools. A big part of it has to do with the teacher that is there, trying to actualize or not, right? And at times, what is the preventing factor is how the teacher is able to maneuver through the governance, the space, the policy space of the school in making things happen or not happen, right? Sometimes they're not even aware of those things. And they see that impossibility as, oh, the school just doesn't allow this. And in fact, it might be a shift in capacity that might lead to a different kind of work, right? So here's a number of examples of how these things can be done, the practicality of that, right? And the fact that policy is always moving. So policy is not something steady, stuck, right? The text is there, but the text is always trying to solve a problem, and problems continue to change. And so the change in policy that is led by policy practice informed, right, leads to this kind of idea of policy learning that you see on page 118 on that figure, right? The thinking, the practice that pushes an environment into a different, explores, tries things out, and then by doing this, reshapes that environment, right? Repositions it, creates more space, creates different kinds of relationships, creates ease in areas that were harder before, creates opening, windows, right? The idea of policy window is going to be part of what we continue to think about here. And that's what that work is there. The work of Hacklow, for instance, on policy learning that I cite is a critical aspect of it, right? Which leads to us as not just music teachers, but as networked individuals, right? Individuals thinking about coalition, thinking about creating and engaging, as in figure 5.2 on 121, that talks about multiple aspects of our own identity, having a play and having a role, and in how school structures and professional communities can work. Take a look at, for instance, on page 23, and kind of rethink about that. Those two boxes that are there, and how they talk about what it is and how it is that we can function differently as professionals in the field. Some of you already have experience with that. Some of you are working in schools or NGOs or higher education. The key part of this, for me, and the role of all these examples is exactly how do you understand the structure, right? The environment in which you're working, the school. How do you understand when you are new? How do you understand as you become an experienced person within that, right? A known quantity. And how do you think about and are contributed to change? And then how do you think yourself as a member of a professional community, right, that can contribute to that community, music education writ large, and can contribute to that in relationship to the practice of the school environment, the school structure, or the NGO environment, the higher education environment where you're working. right? How these two things come together is a key part of why we talk about policy. It's a key part of what's going to have an impact on how you succeed from, into the first year, into 5 years, and beyond that, right? How you might have an impact and how you might feel about being an agent in that environment. Right? So that's the goal here. Hopefully, chapter 5 get us closer to understanding and shifting why and how we see what policy is and can be. Okay, take care.